The American Civil War was not just fought on battlefields. It was fought in laws, in ideals, and in the future of humanity. What the world learned from it still shapes nations today. In the mid-19th century, a nation that claimed liberty as its foundation was torn apart by its own contradictions. The American Civil War did not begin as a global lesson, yet it ended as one. What unfolded between 1861 and 1865 was more than a struggle for territory or authority. It became a brutal classroom where the modern world learned what division truly cost. For the first time, the world witnessed an industrial war fought by a society still clinging to old ideals. Railroads carried armies at unprecedented speed. Telegraph lines delivered news of death faster than grief could follow. The war proved that future conflicts would no longer be short, heroic, or romantic. They would be total, relentless, and unforgiving. But the battlefield was only one teacher. Slavery was no longer exposed as merely a moral failure. It was revealed as a political and economic poison capable of destroying an entire country from within. Other nations watched closely and learned that unresolved injustice was not stability. It was a delayed explosion. The war also taught that unity could not be preserved through compromise alone. Decades of political bargaining had postponed conflict, not prevented it. When dialogue failed repeatedly, violence filled the vacuum. The lesson echoed across continents. When fundamental values collide, delay only increases the price of resolution. Equally important was the transformation of warfare itself. The world learned that technology without strategy magnified suffering. Rifled muskets, ironclad ships, and mass artillery made traditional tactics obsolete, yet generals were slow to adapt. The result was a catastrophic loss of life. Future armies would study this war not for glory, but for warnings written in blood. Beyond armies and politics, the Civil War reshaped the meaning of citizenship. It demonstrated that nations were not defined by borders alone, but by who was included within them. Freedom, once declared in words, demanded enforcement through law and sacrifice. This realization influenced reform movements far beyond American shores, inspiring debates on rights, equality, and national responsibility worldwide. Perhaps the most enduring lesson was this: victory did not end the war's consequences. Even after the guns fell silent, scars remained social, economic, and psychological. Reconstruction proved that winning a war was easier than healing a nation. The world learned that peace required more than surrender. It demanded justice, memory, and accountability. The American Civil War ended in 1865, but its lessons did not remain in the past. They traveled forward, warning future generations of what happens when ideals are divided, when humanity is denied, and when power is chosen over principle. The war had revealed itself as something far larger than a clash of armies. It had unfolded as a slow, brutal redefinition of power and freedom, watched closely by a world that had believed those two forces could coexist without conflict. Before the first shots were fired, power had been assumed to belong to institutions, to governments, to those who wrote laws and controlled economies. Freedom had been spoken of as an ideal, celebrated in speeches, printed on paper, and praised from a safe distance. The war exposed how fragile that balance truly was. As states broke apart and loyalties fractured, it became clear that power without a moral foundation could not hold a nation together. Armies marched not only to defend borders, but to defend ideas about who counted as human, who deserved rights, and who existed only to serve. Every battle carried a deeper meaning, because behind every advance or retreat stood millions whose lives were shaped by decisions made far from the front lines. The world watched as freedom, once treated as a philosophical concept, was dragged into the mud of reality. It was tested under cannon fire and paid for in blood. Emancipation did not arrive as a gentle reform. It emerged through devastation. The lesson was unmistakable. Freedom rarely survived without resistance, and power rarely surrendered without force. Nations observing from afar understood that injustice, when protected by authority, did not fade on its own. It hardened. Power itself was transformed during the conflict. It was no longer measured solely by territory or wealth, but by the ability to mobilize people, resources, and belief on an unprecedented scale. Governments learned that controlling land meant little if the population refused to be united by purpose. Authority derived from fear proved unstable, while authority tied to shared ideals endured even under unimaginable loss. At the same time, freedom was redefined. It was no longer seen as a privilege granted by those in control, but as a condition that demanded recognition and defense. The war demonstrated that freedom delayed was freedom denied, and that compromise with injustice only prolonged suffering. Observers across Europe, Latin America, and beyond absorbed this reality, recognizing echoes of their own unresolved conflicts. The cost of redefining these concepts was immense. Cedia's Burnett family shattered, and an entire generation was scarred. Yet through this destruction, a new understanding emerged. Power that ignored humanity ultimately consumed itself. Freedom that lacked enforcement remained hollow. The war forced these truths into the open, where they could no longer be ignored or softened by rhetoric. In the aftermath of each battle, the lesson grew sharper. Victory achieved without justice proved incomplete. Authority exercised without moral clarity invited future rebellion. The world saw that nations were not sustained by strength alone, but by the values they were willing to defend when unity collapsed. What unfolded during those years became a warning etched into history. It showed that the struggle between power and freedom was not abstract, nor temporary. It was a defining force that shaped societies, determined futures, and demanded choices that could no longer be postponed. The realization that nations were fragile did not come solely from the destruction of cities or the staggering loss of life. It came from watching a society unravel under the weight of its own divisions. States that had existed for decades found themselves in open rebellion against one another, and neighbors who had once shared markets and farms now faced each other across battlefields. The American Civil War demonstrated that division, when left unchecked, could erode the very foundations of a country. It showed the world that ideological fault lines could become as deadly as any weapon, capable of toppling governments, destroying economies, and shattering communities in a matter of months. Every day on the front lines reflected a society in crises. Soldiers not only fought for strategic positions but for the recognition of values they had been denied or taken for granted. Families were forced to choose sides, often splitting households in ways that echoed the broader fracture of the nation itself. In towns and villages, far from the battlefield, neighbors who had once lived in trust now eyed each other with suspicion, aware that political allegiance could dictate survival. The war made it clear that unity was not a passive state, but a fragile construct demanding constant effort, understanding, and compromise. When those elements were absent, the cost of division was catastrophic. Across the Atlantic and around the globe, governments and thinkers observed these events with growing concern. They had long assumed that national boundaries provided stability and that institutions were sufficient to prevent internal collapse. The war dispelled that illusion. It revealed that the social and moral fabric of a nation could be just as decisive as military strength or economic power. Observers saw that when a society failed to reconcile its conflicting principles, chaos became inevitable. They understood that ideological compromises postponed confrontation but did not prevent it. History was teaching a lesson through devastation. Delay only magnified the ultimate cost. The American Civil War was more than just a conflict on a distant continent. It was a profound lesson for the entire world. It revealed the devastating consequences of a nation divided against itself, a lesson that resonated in capitals far from American shores. The civilian population bore the brunt of this division. Cities became theaters of suffering, where shortages, displacement, and fear were daily realities. Refugees, streaming across state lines, carried with them harrowing stories of destruction and betrayal. a stark reminder that internal conflict inflicts wounds that extend far beyond borders. Economically, global trade faltered. Diplomacy grew tense and complicated as even distant nations began to brace for the ripple effects that threatened their own stability. The world learned a harsh truth. Division within one country could have global consequences. This wasn't just a domestic squabble, it was a global event. The political landscape, once predictable, became a chaotic battleground of ideas, ambition, and sheer survival. Laws that once promised unity now seemed powerless. Compromises that had held the nation together became sources of bitter resentment. The war underscored a critical lesson in governance. It requires more than just negotiation. It demands unshakable principles, the resolve to endure uncertainty, and the courage to confront injustice head-on. Observers worldwide saw that when leaders failed to address the root causes of division, they become complicit in the destruction that follows. Power without accountability leads to consequences that cannot be contained, and freedom without equality becomes a catalyst for conflict, not a guarantor of peace. On the battlefield, these societal fractures were mirrored in strategy and morale. These weren't armies of mercenaries. They were armies of citizens. They were fighting not just for land, but for identity, for justice, for recognition. The stakes were intensely personal, which made every victory bittersweet, and every loss utterly devastating. The world witnessed how a divided society could produce both immense courage and immense suffering, and realized that no nation could survive indefinitely while ignoring the deep divisions within. The Civil War became a grim illustration of what happens when ideals collide, when justice is postponed, and when unity is taken for granted instead of actively nurtured. The consequences of this internal collapse were magnified by how the war transformed the very nature of conflict in society. It became brutally clear that no battle was a simple contest of numbers or territory. Each clash was a convergence of technology, strategy, human endurance, and the collective will of a society. The world had seen wars, of course, but rarely one that fused industrial might with ideological convictions so completely. Cannons and rifles were no longer just tools of destruction. They became instruments measuring a nation's ability to organize, sustain, and commit itself to an ideal. The scale of mobilization was unprecedented. The staggering number of casualties served as a brutal wake-up call that future conflicts would demand more than just courage. They would demand innovation, adaptation, and a willingness to endure the unimaginable. From the first skirmishes to the most devastating battles, the war revealed that combat had entered a new, terrifying era. Soldiers faced weapons that had rewritten the rules of engagement. Tactics that once guaranteed glory now guaranteed death. Old strategies were useless against rifled muskets and ironclad warships. Armies learned that survival depended not just on bravery, but on anticipating the enemy, adapting to new technology, and understanding the human cost of every single maneuver. Military minds across the globe took note, recognizing that the age of romanticized combat was over. The battlefield now demanded science, discipline, and an unflinching assessment of risk. But the war's impact stretched far beyond tactics. It reshaped the very fabric of society, forcing people to confront fundamental questions of identity, citizenship, and justice. Freedmen and women, once enslaved and denied basic humanity, became living symbols of the larger struggle. Their freedom wasn't just handed to them by legislation. It was won through struggle, sacrifice, and a societal reckoning that challenged centuries of deeply entrenched hierarchy. Observers abroad noted how profoundly social transformation could be intertwined with military conflict. Nations realized that the outcomes of war weren't confined to treaties or new borders. They echoed through communities, families, and generations. The economic implications were equally profound. The destruction of infrastructure, the rerouting of trade, and the colossal demands of mass mobilization showed that modern war required resources on a scale that dwarfed anything seen before. Factories were repurposed to churn out arms and supplies. Railroads became the arteries of survival. Communication networks, like the telegraph, transformed the speed at which decisions were made and executed. The world learned that industrial capacity and logistical organization were now just as critical to victory as courage on the field. The Civil War proved that society itself had become a weapon of war. A nation unprepared to fully support its armies could not hope to survive the demands of a total conflict. The war also cast a harsh light on the moral dimensions of leadership. The choices of those in power, once abstract, now had immediate, deadly consequences. Commanders and politicians discovered their responsibilities went far beyond strategy and governance. They bore the weight of lives, the hopes of millions, and the unblinking judgment of history. Observers in Europe, Asia, and the Americas saw that leadership in a time of crisis was inseparable from accountability and ethics. The American Civil War demonstrated that a nation's strength is inseparable from the wisdom and conscience of those who guide it. Communication and information also became weapons. Telegraph lines transmitted news of victory and defeat faster than any horse, shaping morale and international perception in real time. Newspapers carried stories of heroism, suffering, and atrocity to readers thousands of miles away, creating a global audience for a seemingly local conflict. The world saw that information could inflame, inform, and inspire, and that controlling its flow was as vital as controlling territory. The Civil War foreshadowed the future of global conflict, where public opinion and narrative would play roles as important as those of generals and soldiers. Perhaps the most profound lesson of all was that no nation can ever truly isolate itself from the consequences of its own choices. The war showed that injustice, if left unchallenged, will eventually demand a reckoning through violent upheaval. Division, if ignored, invites catastrophe. Freedom, if merely proclaimed but not enforced, is a hollow promise. And power, wielded without principle, will ultimately crumble. Every battlefield, every policy, every life lost became part of a broader narrative, a story in which nations learn, often at a terrible price, that survival depends not only on strength, but on vision, courage, and an unwavering commitment to the values they claim to uphold. In observing the transformation of warfare, society, and leadership, the world recognized a new paradigm. Conflicts were no longer isolated episodes. They were crucibles that tested the moral, social, and technological limits of nations. The Civil War became a mirror, reflecting both the potential for greatness and the peril of human ambition. It taught that history is shaped not just by victories and losses, but by a society's capacity to confront its divisions, to embrace justice, and to evolve in the face of unimaginable trials. The American Civil War, in its devastation and its lessons, left an imprint that reached far beyond the borders of the United States. It showed that freedom can never be taken for granted, that power without principle is fragile, and that divisions left unaddressed can threaten the very existence of a nation. The world learned that wars were no longer simple contests of force. They were tests of a society's character, its morality, and its vision. Nations observing this conflict understood that progress demands courage, justice, and unity, and that the consequences of ignoring these truths can echo for generations. From the battlefield to the halls of government, from the cries of the oppressed to the strategies of generals, the Civil War became a timeless warning, a study in both the cost of division and the enduring power of human resilience. It reminded the world that history's most important lessons are written not just in victory, but in the struggle to build a nation that truly lives up to its ideals. Thank you for watching. If you found this reflection on history valuable, please consider subscribing for more content.